Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Planet to Plate Festival. 3 days of talks, performances and live events to celebrate the work of the Institute for Sustainable Food here at the University of Sheffield. I'm Peter Jackson, and I'm one of the directors of the Institute for Sustainable Food.
And I'm Duncan Cameron, the other director of the Institute for Sustainable Food.
We thought we'd start by saying a little bit about the Institute's vision, and then a little bit about our Planet to Plate title, and then we'll get down to more conversational discussion between Duncan and me. So the Institute's vision is to find new ways to understand the complexities of the food system, to meet the grand challenge of feeding the world's growing population in a socially just and environmentally sustainable way. Our Planet to Plate title is adapted from some words by the US food historian Warren Belasco. Warren said that food binds past and present, individual and society, private household and world economy. He talked about connections between palate and power. And we've adapted his words to talk about Planet to Plate, to emphasise the way the Institute's work crosses all scales from the global or planetary scale right down to domestic households and individuals having a meal together. The next 3 days are going to include an art science encounter with a renowned artist and drag queen, cooking demonstrations with a finalist of MasterChef India, and a musical performance that won the Royal Society's annual award for public engagement, as well as some more conventional talks and discussions. The speakers come from 8 departments and 4 faculties within the University of Sheffield, which really demonstrates the nature of interdisciplinary working within the Institute, plus some invited guests from Sheffield and indeed from across the world, from India and Zimbabwe. We hope the next few days will demonstrate the transformative power of collaborative working across academic departments and disciplines, with partners from government, business and civil society, with artists and performers. We think this kind of collaboration is needed to address the problems, the inequalities, the inefficiencies, the injustices that characterise the current agri-food system, and to achieve a transition towards a more just, sustainable and healthy future. So today's opening event is going to be a conversation between Duncan and myself as co-directors of the Institute for Sustainable Food. We'll start with some definitions and discussions of the grand challenge of food security and sustainability. We'll talk about the food system and what we mean by taking a food system approach. And we'll also be talking in a more personal way about the nature of our academic collaboration and the partnership we've struck up in order to make a success of our Institute of Sustainable Food. So we're going to start the conversation in just a minute, but before we do, let me just say that you're very welcome to post questions or comments on the live chat. We'll end in time for us to have a Q&A with you in the audience. So please use live chat, or you can submit questions on Twitter using the hashtag #PlanetToPlate, or one word. So let me start then by asking Duncan to say a few words about the nature of food security and sustainability as global challenges.
Well, thanks for the intro there, Peter. And I think, it's been hotly debated what we mean by food security. And the definition that we've got is a complex one and a socio-political one at that. So when we talk about food security, the agreed and established definition of what food security would mean is that all people at all times would have safe, healthy and nutritious food that allow them to lead an active life. And I think, it's been really helpful to get that kind of definition. But I think there are some challenges, particularly in the context of sustainability, because that definition doesn't really embrace the idea that we have to live within the limited resources that our planet affords. So I struggle with that definition of food security ever so slightly, because it doesn't recognise the fact that, for example, agriculture globally will produce around about a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions. Simple processes like making nitrogen fertiliser, one single chemical reaction consumes at least 2% of all the energy that we generate on this planet in a year. That kind of shows you the potential environmental damage that food production can do, and that's not to mention the deforestation and land use change that's often associated with intensive agriculture. So I don't think we would necessarily reach food security when all people at all times have healthy, safe, nutritious food to allow them to lead an active life. For me, that has to be done within the boundaries of sustainability and what we often consider the planetary boundaries. So the maximum amount of resource that we could expend to produce food that is sustainable and doesn't contribute to the climate crisis.
Yeah, I think you're right to point out the complexities of that definition. There's a really nice, simple definition about food security being sustainable, healthy food for all. And the research councils have adopted that as a sort of tagline. But the longer definition you've been referring to, invented in the 1990s by the World Health Organization, is really convoluted in talking about physical access to food, the affordability of food, whether that food is any old food, it's just about fuel, or whether it has to be culturally appropriate food. It's about people's preferences and lifestyles. So it goes from something which is relatively simple and a sort of economic accessibility to something which is much more socially, culturally, politically complex. And I think that's exactly where we are as an Institute for Sustainable Food. We often talk about food security and sustainability being as much a cultural or a social question as it is a technical one. And that's the sort of thing we're getting at. Food is much more than fuel. It's much more than nutrition and calories. Food is something in which people are really socially and culturally invested. Think about ideas of feeding the family, the gender division of labour involved in producing food across the world. All kinds of ways in which food means much more to people than simply getting a meal on the plate or keeping themselves fed.
And I think that's kind of reflected in the programme that we put together this week, that we wanted to embrace the cultural dimensions of food and of eating, because we can talk about food, the production of the fuel, but there are some really important cultural dimensions around the consumption of that food. And like you say, the notion of the Sunday lunch for me, that's a really important cultural component of consuming food and spending time with my family. And I think, one of the most important things that we've done at the Institute is to bring together those disciplines in a meaningful way and find the core questions that we need to answer to achieve the real definition of food security.
Yeah. And perhaps we should say a few words about sustainability as well, which, if food security is a complex term, sustainability is no less so, I think. We often equate it with environmental sustainability and living within planetary limits, but it also has important social and economic dimensions as well. So a conventional definition of sustainability would be about meeting the needs of the present generation without compromising the needs of future generations. And that goes back to the Brundtland Commission in the 1980s. But I think we'd be equally interested in those social and cultural dimensions as we are in those related to the natural environment.
Yeah. And I think the two play off one another. I mean, I was fortunate enough when the Paris climate negotiations were happening, be invited to go to Paris and to present my work and to really start to pick apart and understand the implications of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the framework that the UN has put together to help us achieve exactly what Peter's been talking about. But I think, you know, there aren't the kind of natural science versus the sociocultural dimensions to food security. They don't sit in isolation with one another. They interact with one another, play off against one another, and often define one another. And particularly when we think about the usage of fuel and economic development in the global south, you know, that has a sustainability dimension, it has a sociocultural dimension, and we really need to understand how those two dimensions will interact with one another to define a sustainable food future.
Yeah, and I think the other element is social justice within this as well. You could conceive of a sustainable food system on a global scale, but that wouldn't mean it was socially just or equitable between global north and south, between countries within the global north, and even, you know, in an affluent country like the UK. So the impact of COVID-19 on the food system has shown how vulnerable we are, how easy it is for people to tip over into being food insecure, having a lack of security over their access to food on a daily or weekly basis. We've seen a massive rise in the number of people needing emergency food aid, and Hannah Lammy-Mumford will be talking about that later in this series of events. So that question of social justice highlighted by COVID-19, but there throughout the food system, is something that's just as important, I think, as the environmental and economic dimensions of sustainability.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, you mentioned the food system several times there, Peter, and I think, you know, taking a systems level approach, which means understanding how all of these complex factors play off against one another, define each other, drive each other, is absolutely critical if we're going to navigate successful solutions for a sustainable food future. You know, it's very easy to think, well, we've got this great plan, we're going to solve this problem in food security, only to do that and then realise you've created another problem somewhere else. And when we look at the food system and think about it as a complex system, we can start to predict and mitigate against what we would call these emergent properties, these things that emerge from the complexity of the system because we've made a change somewhere else.
Yeah, I think that's really important. We'll say a little bit more about food systems in just a moment, but I think that idea that thinking in a system terms with lots of interconnections and linkages is really different from a kind of linear notion that our food supply chain goes from the farm, the field, the ocean, through manufacturing and retail to shops and then to consumers. That linear notion is really flawed, and it lends itself to all kinds of perverse effects. You tweak something at one point in the system and it has implications elsewhere in the system. And if you think in system terms, you're much less likely to fall into that trap than in the conventional linear notion.
And I guess that's what really brought us together, isn't it? You know, the need for being able to look at the food system and understand those complexities. So just for the audience at home, I'm an environmental microbiologist and biological chemist, very much at the hard end of science, and my work is really focused on trying to understand how we can produce, make crops more sustainable and use less resources. But that's a very kind of technocratic, top-down way of looking at food. And I think for me, the work that we've done together has been really eye-opening because it's brought in these other dimensions, and I think, you know, it shows the need for diverse leadership when trying to think about food security, predict what the problems might be and find solutions for them.
Yeah, no, I think the way we'll talk about the Institute in a bit more detail later on, but I think that combination of a natural scientist and a social scientist like me at the helm of the Institute has been really important to how it's developed. And that's why we've got people from, you know, all the faculties lots of different departments involved, and we've been able to strike up the kinds of conversations we've had and do the collaborative research we've had. And that, in a way, is the sort of motif for this festival, is to show the power of those kinds of collaborations, and indeed not just within a university setting, but outside in the real world. So we've talked a bit about the food system, and that may be a phrase that's not an everyday one, and people may be confused about what we're saying. So we've produced a little explainer video, we call it, just a short video that takes you through what we mean by the food system. It's available on our website, but I think with the help of our IT colleagues here at the university today, we'll just be able to pause now and show you that short video.
Getting food onto our plate is a complicated process. The food system is often described as a process that extends from farm to fork, suggesting growers simply drop their produce off at the supermarket, ready for us to eat. At the Institute for Sustainable Food, we think this simple, linear view ignores the vast complexity of our global food system, and it ignores the potentially catastrophic effects of what can happen if just one part of this fragile system is damaged. We need to understand the full complexity of the system to build a more sustainable food future. Soil needs to be full of nutrients to grow healthy crops. Market pressures mean single crops are grown intensively in one area, depleting the soil of nutrients. Fertilizers are used to replenish the soil, and pesticides are used to protect plants from disease. But these release greenhouse gases and contribute to the climate crisis. The climate crisis causes increased flooding and drought, which is damaging to plant and soil health. If a crop fails, the energy and time put into growing it is lost, as is the producer's income and our chance to eat it. To build a sustainable food future, it's vital that we recognise growing food causes pollution and trade-offs in sustainability. At the Institute, we're seeking to address the entire food system and the complex interconnections between all of its key parts. We're working with producers to improve soil health and developing less polluting fertilizers. We know that increasing crop diversity helps, so we're researching ways to do this without harming the producer's income. We're also developing crops that are resilient to pests, floods, and drought. And we're studying how good bacteria can help plants fight disease without pesticides. But this is only part of the story. Our food is also caught up in wider social and cultural systems of governance and regulation, in international trade agreements, and in the complex organisation of food processing, manufacturing, and retailing. This globalised system has enabled most people in wealthy nations like ours to enjoy diverse, plentiful diets of out-of-season produce. While in other parts of the world, people don't have access to nutritious food. To receive our food, we use vast, polluting and wasteful supply chains. At present, a third of all food produced is wasted, and rotting food in landfill is a major emitter of greenhouse gases. Year-round availability of fruit and vegetables depends on food being imported from other countries in the global south, which is more vulnerable to failure caused by climate breakdown. The abundant choice which is available in some parts of the world comes at a huge cost to populations and environments in other parts of the world. Therefore, to build a truly sustainable food future, we also need to recognise that the system is unfair. At the Institute, we seek to make supply chains more efficient and resilient to social and economic shocks. We're working to improve equity in resource distribution, promoting more effective governance, and devising less wasteful food production and consumption practices. The health of the environment, food, and people are at the heart of everything we do. Understanding the complexity of the food system is vital to creating a food system that's sustainable, fair, and just for everyone.
Well, we hope that little explainer worked in terms of talking through a more circular view, a more systemic view of the food system. We thought we should say a few words about the sort of scale of the global challenge that we're addressing at the Institute. So we could talk about feeding the world's growing population, a population that's likely to increase from around 7.7 billion now to almost 10 billion by 2050. And at the same time as that population increases, the resources to feed the world they'll stay stable, or they may even shrink. They might shrink as a result of the impacts of the climate crisis, the effects of urbanisation on the availability of land. There'll also be a loss of biodiversity and a whole series of things which kind of combine in a way which former government chief scientist Sir John Beddington called a perfect storm. So at the same time as all that happens, demand is likely to increase, not just from the numbers of population, but also from changing diets in different parts of the world. So in the so-called emerging economies, we're likely to see a shift away from rice, vegetable-based diets towards diets which are more like our diets in the West, heavy in meat and dairy products that are much more demanding on planetary resources. So that, in a nutshell, is the challenge we're seeking to address within the Institute.
And I think, despite being a truly grand challenge of global scale, one of the critical roles of the Institute for Sustainable Food is not just to define the problem, as is often an academic exercise, but to actually find real, tangible solutions, and solutions that are not top-down, that are co-created with the communities and countries and people that require those solutions. And so one of the really exciting opportunities within the Institute has been to build a really diverse community of scientists and social scientists, arts and humanities researchers, engineers and medics that often have a really international dimension to their work. And particularly, working with the early career researchers, we've had the privilege of being able to build a cohort of PhD level researchers that really are doing groundbreaking and exciting work across the world, working in the places that they need to co-create and co-design and build solutions for a sustainable food future. And for me, that's one of the most exciting things that we've been able to do.
So one of the events we'll hear about later on is from colleagues in the Grantham Centre for Sustainable Futures, and both Duncan and I have been involved in that centre from its inception. It's trained a whole generation of PhD students to meet global challenges. It's also been responsible for the so-called desert garden work that you'll hear about if you join that session later on in the week. So those kind of collaborations are really important to us as well, not seeing the Institute as a kind of closed shop, but very much open to work with colleagues across the university and indeed well beyond that.
I guess seeing food in the wider context of environmental sustainability, in what we often call the food, energy, water nexus, where ensuring that we've got enough food, enough energy, and enough clean water are the linchpins really to a globally sustainable future.
Yeah, and those Grantham students, and Duncan and I have both supervised some of them, have an extra period of time in their PhD programme to get out into the world, to do some engagement with stakeholders, political lobbying, and Jeremy Grantham, who funded the Grantham Centre, talks about getting arrested, not being afraid to make a point, to engage in campaigning work and political work as well, underpinned by the science and evidence that people learn as part of their PhD training. And that's very much our ethos as well. So this is a grand challenge we're talking about here in terms of feeding the world, and it certainly involves changes in how food is produced, but it also, as Duncan said, talks about the need for quite significant changes in patterns of consumption, and that might be towards less meat and dairy consumption, more fruit and veg and so on. And if everyone changed that overnight, we wouldn't be able to supply that given our current production systems. So production and consumption are intimately linked in ways which we're keen to explore. And it's also important to think, when we talk about consumption, to realise how, because of the social and culturally embedded nature of people's diets, simply telling people what they should or shouldn't eat will not lead to widespread change. So part of the social and cultural dimensions of the work we're doing in the Institute is to address the very difficult process of behaviour change, and not addressing that purely at an individual level or in terms of giving people information and hoping they'll do the right thing, but thinking about the institutions and the infrastructure that support the patterns of diet and consumption that we have, and addressing them in terms of those wider practices rather than just in terms of telling individuals what they should or shouldn't do.
And I think democratising access to sustainable food is something that is really important to me and you, Peter, and to the Institute at large, because it's very easy for sections of the press to make judgments about people's dietary choices, but I think we have to understand them in the context of to what extent that really is a choice. So demonising processed foods is I think a very easy thing to do until you recognise that actually the most food secure that some people on low incomes can be is because they eat processed food that isn't going to go off. And when you look at it through that lens, suddenly you start to understand why people make the decisions that they do. And from my perspective as a natural scientist, that was a game changer. Yep. And has, I guess, really started to shape my thinking about how we solve some of these grand challenges, and particularly thinking about diets and thinking about, well, what is the obviously most sustainable diet possible? And, we might think that being vegetarian or vegan is the most sustainable way of eating it, and it can be. But some of the work that we've done here and others have done have revealed that actually diets are really complex things, and the window of CO2 emissions from diets that we might consider sustainable, like a vegan diet, is absolutely huge. Eating highly produced soy-based products, for example, as your major protein source, can actually be worse than eating meat, and those kind of perverse outcomes in terms of the sustainability of diets, I think, is something that we've really been trying to pick apart and do some work on.
Yeah. So what Duncan's talked about there is a really good example, I think, of natural science and social science talking to each other and learning from each other, because there's so much moralisation, as I call it, going on in the food system, where people are blamed for the choices they make. So working class mothers who don't know how to cook, or who feed their kids on chocolatey cereals for breakfast rather than wholesome porridge or whatever. It's really easy to take a kind of moral line and blame people for the choices they make. And my friend and colleague Ang Murcott also often talks about the good reasons for bad behaviour, all of that in scare quotes. But why do people continue to do things that they know are not ideal in terms of the health of their children or the sustainability of the food system? And often there are very good reasons for people doing that. If you're feeding a family on a budget, you want to feed them things you know they will eat, rather than suddenly switching to broccoli or avocado or aubergines or something, which might be quite expensive, and which, if they lead to food waste, doesn't even feed the family in the way that people might want to. So it's those sort of social and cultural complexities that are as important as the kind of global shifts in agricultural production that we're also working on.
And I think that kind of, as a natural scientist, working with you, Peter, has really helped reframe some of the questions that I ask about primary productivity in exactly that context. And you're going to hear a bit about Desert Garden, which is an amazing project that I had the privilege of being involved in, which was co-creating a food production system in the Jordanian desert with refugees from the Syrian crisis. But I think, some of that technology we brought back home, and Hamish Cunningham's going to talk about about some of those technologies in terms of hydroponic growing and local food production later on today, actually.
Yes.
And there, it was really important to understand what you needed to grow and why, and ensure that if you're going to produce food locally to support local communities in eating healthily, you have to make sure you understand what people want to eat and what people are able to eat, what they know how to cook, for example. So there's some really good examples there, I think, of the work we've done together that have really set the context for the natural science work. And it's very easy to go off as a tangent at natural scientists thinking you know what the right thing to do is, but until you work with people who do know what the right things to grow are in the right places at the right times, you can contribute to the problem. For example, you can build food waste.
Yeah, those are all really good examples, I think, of the kind of what we're talking about as the power of collaboration. And I think it is a sort of direction of travel now within academic research, particularly around food issues. So I think that the days of the sort of lone scholar or the single discipline approach to things is waning. And I think there is now much more support for the kind of things we're trying to do in our Institute for Sustainable Food, which is based on the power and creativity of collaboration. So the way our institute is organised is into 3 pillars, we call them. One is a more or less natural science one about plant production and protection. A third is a more or less social science one about food consumption and sustainability. But they're linked by the central pillar, which looks at the transformational nature of not just knowledge transfer, but the way that addressing these problems in a combined way transforms the nature of the research. So I think that division of 3 pillars is somewhat artificial. And most of the things we've done and the things that have been most successful work across those conventional boundaries. And that's very much what this 3-day festival is about, is demonstrating that. So some of those encounters might be between science and policy. So the kind of stuff we were talking about in terms of food insecurity. Some of them will be connections with stakeholders. And the final event in this 3 days is some of our work with Regather, the Sheffield's food cooperative, where they're working towards what they call a values-based food system. So not just treating food as a commodity, a vision that we share with them. Some of our collaborations with artists and musicians, and I have to say secretly those are the events I'm most looking forward to over the next couple of days. So we'll hear Ryan Taylor's aquaculture project, a musical collaboration at 2 o'clock today, and we'll hear from the artist and sculptor Anthony Bennett tomorrow. So those are some of the slightly more out there versions, I suppose, for universities to involve themselves in. But they're really powerful demonstrations. And we might just want to say a little bit, often art-science encounters are using the arts as a sort of illustration for a scientific project. And we've really tried to go beyond that and to make the collaboration more genuine, more transformative, more immersive, right from the get-go, rather than doing a piece of science research and thinking, oh, we'll have an exhibition at the end. So Duncan, you've been heavily involved in that. Do you want to just say a little bit more about that kind of process and that approach?
Absolutely. I've been really privileged to be very much involved in the science art movement, particularly through a set of collaborations with the world-renowned artist Anthony Bennett, who's really expanded my horizons in terms of thinking about the power of art and science working together. And I think, as Peter said, one of the kind of traditional paradigms for sci art is that the art somehow represents or literally conveys a scientific question, problem, piece of information. And that has its power, but it also essentially is using what we would consider the deficit model for public engagement. So it's responding to some sort of deficit in knowledge. And actually, we found it's much more interesting to start asking questions around how people feel about the food system rather than presenting information. Because a lot of our decisions about what we eat are rational, but a lot of them play to our emotions. Food is such an emotive and emotional thing. You know, if I'm absolutely miserable, a bowl of mashed potato cheers me up no end. And we all have a food that makes us feel happy. So that emotional connection to food, I think, is really important. And there's nothing more powerful than the arts to speak to one's emotions, but also to provide a space for us to ask questions. You know, it can be quite intimidating if I'm, as a professor, giving a public lecture. The power dynamics are very skewed, but through the arts we can dissolve those power dynamics, and we can create spaces for people to ask questions, not just of the scientists, but of themselves, or to actually go out and find more, and to present complex issues that don't necessarily have a right answer, that are emotionally uncomfortable, that make us feel uncomfortable. Things like the GM debate, for example. By creating artworks that speak to our emotions, it often allows us to think about those issues in totally revolutionary ways. And Ryan's piece of work, Aquaculture, is a musical and video piece that speaks to the often controversial practice of fish farming. You know, the way that we will produce sustainable protein for much of the global south that is culturally appropriate and people want to eat is through fish farming. But there are potential environmental issues to fish farming, and there are issues in terms of access to traditional spaces, traditional waters that come from them being used for aquacultural purposes. So how on earth do you bring all those complexities together? Well, the way Ryan decided to do it was through music, and he's going to tell you quite a lot about his process. But I think one of the really unique dimensions to the way that he and a lot of the other artists that we've worked with have been involved in the academic work is to have been there from the outset. So Ryan and Anthony and many of the other artists that we've worked with at the Institute are often there at the first meeting of a project. You know, they will give a talk about the power of science and art working together on equal footing with an expert on aquaculture or on hydroponics, for example. And that's really important that we share a stage. And at the very start of the process of doing our joint research, because the art can form a component of the research, we can really start to learn things about the project that we didn't know. And the thing that I've learned more than anything else is understanding the power of narrative in communicating my research, not just to a public audience, but to my peers as scientists. And certainly, you know, working with artists, understanding narrative, understanding how you build narrative has transformed how I write. And I've seen it in the kind of journals that publish my work now, that are often the broader and more widely read journals, which I wasn't accessing before because I hadn't quite got that narrative. And that's an example of the arts feeding directly into my research practice as a scientist.
Yeah. So what Duncan refers to there as a narrative, I suppose in more everyday language we talk about as storytelling. Yeah. And that doesn't mean the stories are made up, they're fictitious, they're fiction. It means how do we tell a story in a compelling way that engages an audience? And how do we recognise that people can have quite different stories about the same thing? So GM will be a great example of that, and intensive fish farming will be another as well. People have a coherent story to tell, but it may not be the same as somebody else's equally compelling, but a contested kind of version of what's going on. So I think these art science encounters are really good for opening up what you might call a safe space for that kind of discussion. where people can have genuinely held attitudes and beliefs, but can recognise that they're in conflict with others who have different points of view. So that safe space is a really important part of these art-science encounters as well. And I think another thing that's relevant, especially to what Ryan will be talking about later on after lunch, is the question of how people are audiences for these kinds of discussions. So we can create a piece of art, or we can write an article in a journal, but we need to think through how that message, that story, will be received. So audiences are often taken to be quite passive, sitting slumped in front of the telly, hardly paying attention kind of thing. We think audiences are much more active than that. They are responding to, critiquing things, bringing their own experience to bear on an issue. So all of that stuff is going on in these art science encounters as well. And I know in the PhD that Ryan is writing, he's paying some attention to that process of how audiences engage with a musical performance. How do they make sense of it? What do they bring to bear in terms of their understanding of it? And so it's not just we do some research, we create a piece of music and the job is done. It's thinking about how that sort of circuit of meanings and understandings works. And that is a really powerful way in which a social scientist like me can get involved with Duncan, a natural scientist, and Ryan, a creative musician. So those are really kind of juicy encounters, I think, that are exactly what we're trying to promote. And they're not a sort of sideshow. They're not an illustration of the serious work of art, the serious work of science or art. They're absolutely part of making sense of the world and addressing these grand challenges that we've been speaking about. So yeah, that storytelling is really important. Just before we move on from that, Tony Ryan, our colleague who you're going to hear about in the Desert Garden thing, talks about the way in which scientists need to get that storytelling right. He talks about, almost jokingly I think, he talks about the first paragraph of a grant application. And that first paragraph needs to grab the attention not just of specialists in your own academic field, but of a wider audience. What's at stake here? What's the grand challenge? So what is a really good question to ask people when they're writing grant proposals. You care about it, it's your research, but why should I care? And that sort of thinking in terms of this bigger narrative, thinking about what's at stake, is really where an institute like ours that goes across disciplines can help. So we spend quite a bit of time, particularly with early career researchers who are formulating grant proposals, to work on that. You don't want to lose the reviewers of your grant proposal in the first paragraph. You want to grab their attention and then carry that strand through the proposal itself. So there are some quite instrumental reasons, I think, for other scientists getting to grips with this kind of collaborative approach, this wider thinking, because it will actually help them secure the funding for the kind of work they want to do.
And I think we've talked a lot about framing and understanding the problem, but this kind of process is really critical to designing solutions. At the Institute for Sustainable Food, we're not about doom and gloom scenarios. We're about embracing the seriousness of the grand challenge of food insecurity. But we are here to provide practical solutions to the problems that we frame. And I think understanding the problem in this really wide context, creating a space where people can engage with you at a number of levels while you're kind of thinking through the potential solutions to, for example, a sustainable aquaculture. I think it's really important to use all of the tools at your disposal, and that really has allowed us in the institute. We've only been going for a couple of years now to do some really fundamental work that has provided or is in the process of providing solutions to really important problems like plant diseases that are on the march because of climate change. Or in Peter's work, and I'll probably say a bit about this later, in terms of how you design food policy that's fit for purpose.
Yeah, okay. So at the moment we've made this all sound, it's definitely exciting stuff. We've made it sound easy, and perhaps we should spend a few moments reflecting on what's hard about this stuff. because the reason people work in their academic silos and publish in narrowly specialised journals is because that's how we've been trained and that's what we've kind of learnt to do, kind of warts and all. So I think some of the challenges for me in starting to work across a range of sciences, arts and humanities has been sort of learning to respect differences. So not just riding over them and pretending they don't exist. But we know, for example, that the journal article is the gold standard in the natural sciences. Books and chapters are much more acceptable in arts and humanities subjects. Or, the single authored thing is what's important for academic career progression, promotions and things in arts and humanities, some social sciences, whereas in other disciplines, particularly in science, engineering and so on, there is just a presumption that it'll be team-based and co-authored work is the norm. So you need to be aware of those things, I think, when you engage in the kind of project we're doing. It doesn't necessarily fit with the metrics that are used in specific disciplines or in research assessment exercises. It's more risky. And I think we need to admit that. But we think, and I think now there's a broader school of thought that those risks pay off, and they're indeed risks we need to take in order to address the challenges that we face. So I think that sort of different conventions in different disciplines needs to be understood and negotiated rather than sort of buried away. And there are still occasions when some of the knowledge transfer work we do will be regarded as not proper science, or why are you wasting your time talking to these artists when you should be doing some proper research? So there's still that view around, and those views need to be challenged. And the best way to challenge them is to do really exciting work that has an impact, gets cited, transforms the field. And I think we're now starting to get a sort of track record of showing how we can do that. So I don't want to downplay the challenges involved in interdisciplinary collaboration or collaboration outside of academia altogether. But I think that's now the nature of the game, rather than it being some strange thing that a few people committed to interdisciplinarity are doing.
And I think, Peter, like you say, embracing those challenges has been really important. And I think we really have seen it pay off. We've been very fortunate that we put a lot of hard work into it, but we were very fortunate at the start of this year to be awarded one of 4 major grants for transforming UK food systems. And I think that really is a recognition of the fact that we have grasped the nettle of the challenges in terms of doing deeply interdisciplinary science that aims to solve problems from very fundamental basic science through to highly applied. And the nature of our institute is that it welcomes all of those people. If you don't do the basic research, you don't have anything to apply. And it's important that not everybody can or wants to do all of that. Not everybody wants to do a basic piece of research and take it through into translation. There's space for different types of people that are specialists in different types of work. And I think that was the underpinning for the reason we were awarded one of the 4 centres in the UK for transforming the UK food system from the ground up. And I'm really excited about the translational opportunities and the impact of the work that we're doing now.
Yeah, so Duncan's talking there about what we call the H3 project, which stands for Healthy Soils, Healthy Food, Healthy People. And it's a really good illustration of that interdisciplinary approach, the food systems approach we've been talking about, and then the translational nature of this work, not simply being about academic discovery, but also having real traction in terms of transformations we might make towards a healthier and more sustainable food system. And I think one of the reasons we were successful in that bid against lots of competition across the UK is that we had this kind of ethos of collaboration built up before the call for this particular programme came out. So lots of groups up and down the country were sort of scrabbling together to assemble an interdisciplinary team, to find stakeholders in government, industry and civil society. And in many ways, the kind of preparatory work we've done put us in a really good position to have cleared that ground and be ready to formulate a compelling proposal that worked, as Duncan said, from the ground up. So we've got some scientific work, lab-based work, improving the efficiency of and productivity of hydroponic food production. We've got work on the regenerative nature of agriculture, not just in a farm or a field scale, but at the landscape scale. We've got experiments in biofortification, where we argue that making changes at an early stage in the food system avoids very expensive remedial work that needs to be done later on. We've got work that combines in what we call hybrid farms, hydroponic production with conventional soil-based agriculture. We've got work on increasing the consumption of fibre in the diets, particularly of low-income communities, and so on. We've got work on the resilience of the food system to shocks, whether that's climate change or COVID-19 or economic cycles. So that kind of set of projects would not have been possible had we not been working over a pretty long period of time, building those collaborations, not just in Sheffield, but across with 5 other university partners and more than 30 stakeholders out there in the beyond academia. So getting the foundations of that discussion right, so we're ready to bid for a big programme. And then, as Duncan said, we were one of 4 to be successful in that process. And then those 4 projects will join together to make a really significant, I think, potentially, once in a lifetime kind of change. And our success will be measured in terms of what kind of transformation do we make to the food system, rather than just how many papers do we publish, how many conferences do we go to. And that's a really good place for the Institute to be. We're demonstrating that we can compete for those very large grants, but it's not just a sort of performance indicator kind of checklist. It's also that it has the potential to transform the kind of work we're doing. So please, I think we're nearly ready to start the discussion from your Q&A. So if you have questions and you haven't already posted them, please do so on the Twitter hashtag Planet to Plate handle, or on the comments
live
facility
chat.
And live chat. Thank you, Duncan, for bailing me out there. So yes, we could talk more. We could talk forever. We get on really well as a partnership as well, leading our Institute for Sustainable Food. But Duncan, are there some questions we can respond to already?
We've got quite a few already. So I think the first one's really for you, Peter, which is what can consumers do to help make food systems more sustainable?
Okay, it's a really interesting question. As usual for a social scientist, it's how the question's framed that's interesting. So we can undoubtedly, as individual consumers, make changes to our behaviour. We can waste less food, and there are all sorts of practical tips we could do to think about how we would do that. We could eat less meat or higher quality meat if we could afford it. We can make all sorts of changes in our daily lives. But the onus, I think, is not just on us as individual consumers to do that. We do have power collectively as consumers. If we stop buying processed food and move to other more natural ingredients, supermarkets will listen and make changes. So I'm not underestimating the power of consumer choice. But I think we really need to be conscious that it's not just about individual consumers and their role in the marketplace. It's not just that moment of exchange where we're in a supermarket buying this or that product. I think that's not the way to address the scale of transformation we need within a food system. So that would be thinking about processes of consumption rather than individual consumers. That sounds a bit academic, doesn't it? But if you think about consumption, it's how those choices are framed, how those food items get to be in the supermarket, how the price structure works, how the supply chains work, all that stuff that goes into that moment when we're in the supermarket or at the market buying this or that product. And I think that's a really good lesson from social science on the consumption of food to not just put all the onus on consumers to change their habits, which undoubtedly we can do, but also to think about what I like to call, another fancy phrase, the locus of responsibility. You know, where does responsibility for change lie? Yes, definitely with consumers, but also with supermarkets, with governments, with universities, you name it. So there's a much more shared or distributed sense of responsibility than the way the issues are often presented to us as, look at these consumers wasting food, don't know how to cook from scratch, all that kind of blaming stuff that goes on. So yeah, let's by all means think of the changes we can make as individual consumers, but we're also citizens, not just consumers. We're part of a bigger democratic and political process, and we can really make some changes there.
Okay, brilliant. I think this next one's for both of us, which is the green movement doesn't always have the best relationship with science, GM food, nuclear energy. What can be done to foster cooperation between the two? Shall I?
Yeah, you start and I'll chip in. Yep.
So this is a subject that's really close to my heart because we often don't have the best relationship with the green movement. I think that's a shame because ultimately we have a lot of shared goals. So a number of years ago, I did a piece of work as a slightly naive natural scientist, working with colleagues in social science and in medicine and health to try and understand people's opposition to GM food. And that was my first foray into collaborative social science research, to try and understand why people, what their underlying drivers were for finding GM food intolerable. And I think what was really important there was to really drill down into why people had this particular response, and you know how food, I guess there is food is very important to us. There's almost some sanctity around food. And I think understanding that as a natural scientist, understanding that the big professor saying GM food is great, you should believe me, is nonsense when we're talking about something that's as emotive as food. So I think, you know, for me, the way to foster collaboration is to find the commonalities rather than focus on the areas where we don't agree. And I think through the arts and humanities is a really good way to start to find that safe space. And I did a piece of work with Anthony Bennett called The Gene Genie, which was based on the idea of public art. So accessible art in public spaces, in this case in a pub, and that really started to tease apart mine and Anthony's kind of conversations around GM, the pros and the cons, the issues, the opportunities, and do it in a fun and a more emotive way. And I think that opened up a lot of conversations, certainly when I was having a drink on a Friday night with people in the pub. Oh, you're involved in this, can we talk about it? So I think opening up those opportunities to have conversations through things like accessible art, I think is a really good way of fostering dialogue.
Yeah, it's a good question because it raises all kinds of issues around the relationship between academic evidence, or science if you want to call it that, and campaigning. And I think it is a contested sort of relationship. Some academics will be very much in the service of particular kinds of campaigns. Others want to maintain science as sort of apart from... test. It's at 11 o'clock, so it probably was. If you see Duncan and me running from the room, you'll know it wasn't a test. But let's carry on, assuming we were not alerted to beforehand. Where was I? The sort of respect for evidence kind of question. So one of the things I think that academics contribute to green and other political campaigns is to think about the way in which evidence is gathered and can be most compelling. So one of the reasons I think the GM debate has become so intense, not just in the UK, but across Europe and even across the world, is because some of the early consultations, GM Nation was the sort of almost infamous one now, which wasn't, I think, a very valid form of consultation with the public at large. And thinking about better forms of engaging the public, consultation, involvement of a whole range of publics would be one way in which that contribution of academia to environmental campaigns could be strengthened. So I think there, if you like, there's almost like technical things we could do. I'm involved at the moment with a group working in DEFRA to think about the different kinds of public engagement we might do, from one-off deliberative polls through citizen science, through the kind of public dialogues that have informed the National Food Strategy. And there's a whole range of techniques out there for engaging the public, some of which establish trust and some of which are quite alienating for the public who think they're just being involved in a kind of tick box exercise. So that report will be done within the next month or two, and I think is a really good illustration of a group of social scientists contributing quite an academic piece of research to policymakers like DEFRA, but trying to tease out what's good and bad about different forms of consultation, what's fit for purpose, what's good value for money, how you evaluate its success, and so on. So I think there are some sort of good examples of how we can engage, not just with campaigning, but with public policy more widely, in a way which strengthens those discussions rather than sort of drives a wedge between the politics and the campaigning and the evidence and science.
Brilliant. So this is another one for both of us. They say they're enjoying our conversation. Thank you. But can we share our career highlights and also the most exciting challenge you're working on now?
Oh, right. Okay.
I think I know what the latter one is.
Well, should we start with the challenges? Go on, you start then, if you have something firm in mind.
Well, I think the most exciting challenge that we're working on now, and certainly the most exciting bit of work for my whole career, is the H3 project that we have together. Because it is so, it's really looking at a food system, the UK food system. It goes from very hardcore science and hardcore social science and hardcore health science through into application and a roadmap for making the food system more equitable and sustainable. It's the biggest piece of work I've ever been involved in my life, and it's the one I think that's writing it and delivering it now. It's challenging me the most because it's drawing on every skill learned over the last few years kind of working together. So, I'm super excited because it has the potential to do so much, but also from an intellectual perspective, it's really... We're not burning, so we're probably all right.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's a scale to this H3 project which is challenging. So people like Duncan and me have got to corral 30 academics, more than 30 stakeholders to work together. But we think we've got the track record to do that. I think there are some, like Duncan says, there's intellectual challenges as well as practical ones. So part of that is transforming the UK food system within a 5-year window is impossible. So partly what we're doing in this project is to think about smaller scale pilot projects or case studies or feasibility projects where the challenge to me is how do you scale that up or roll that out? So we work with Regather, or we work with a community group in Bristol. We have some great ideas, but then how do we make that something which works across the UK, or where you get big institutions like hospitals and schools and universities on side to help make those changes? So that to me is something, the academic research we can do, that's something we kind of know how that works. I think the big challenge is this getting the gearing right, or getting the traction. And I think we can be encouraged. The stakeholders we have on board include government departments, they include big retailers and food manufacturers, they include civil society organisations. But I think that's the measure of success over the next 5 years. That's the big challenge, I think, that we face. What was the other part of the question? Things we're most proud of, or something like that. This is going to sound terrible, because the things I'm most proud of tend to be when I've won a grant that allows me to do something on a scale that will make a difference. So I was in the first round of the European Research Council Awards, and I got a project about consumer anxieties about food, and I was really proud of that. That was not just about people being anxious about food on an individual level. It was trying to track the way in which anxieties about food kind of come and go historically, or vary between place to place. And so you could look at a particular incident like the horse meat scandal in 2013, and you could map how that incident played out, who was affected by it, how it was eventually kind of overcome and business returned to something like normal, how governments regulated those kind of things. And I wrote a book called Anxious Appetites, which was a summary of that project. It got a team of people together, not quite as big as the team on H3, but still at that point in my career, that was the biggest group I'd managed to get working together. And really exciting, had some European collaborators as well. So those kind of big projects, you spend months, if not years, writing proposals, getting them through the various stages, going to the interview. And that moment of elation when you win that kind of project is something you don't forget about. But it's important you're not just motivated by winning the grant or the amount of money involved or the amount of people you manage to employ. It's also remembering the kind of big challenges you're trying to address. And that to me is the measure of success, is what kind of change have you made as a result of those projects. Right. So yeah, Duncan and me both share an excitement for H3 and those kind of big opportunities to make a difference. And that's something that takes time in an academic career to build the confidence to do that, the track record to do it. So when it comes off, I think we feel proud, hopefully not in an unpleasant and arrogant way, but in a way that we've managed to achieve something that we've worked to for a long time.
And for me, I think that kind of underpins our partnership, our collaboration, our friendship, is that we both really enjoy doing stuff that makes a difference, and that's what we're proud of. And for me, the Desert Garden project will be the thing that I will be most proud of for my whole career, because it made a difference. And it was a piece of work that I had the privilege of doing with two very close friends, Morid and Tony, and that's one of the things that's brilliant in academia, I think, is that you have the opportunity to build those partnerships that are friendships, and to sit together and just watch what you've done develop into something that makes people's lives better. And it doesn't get better than that.
So those highs are also accompanied by lows as well. We've focused on what we've achieved, but along the way there are big things we've worked on that haven't come off, and you share those moments together as well. Didn't the Research Council understand us? Those stupid reviewers who didn't get our brilliant argument. There's a lot of that happens as well. Yeah. So for each success on the scale we've talked about, there's a learning curve involved as well. So I think having colleagues who are not deflated by that, but who work out ways to recycle an idea or to break it down into smaller parts or whatever, that's part of our kind of academic journey as well. And there's moments where you have to sort of lick your wounds and regroup in order to bid for the next thing or write the next paper or whatever.
I think there's probably time for maybe one or two more questions.
Yep.
Okay. A couple more?
Yes, let's keep going. Yep.
So this is an interesting question. There's a bias in scholarly publishing towards the global north. What can we do to ensure interventions in the global south are led by academics in those areas?
That's a really good question, and it's easy to flick a switch to make a change. Yeah. Journals are trying to make a difference, aren't they? So things like abstracts and titles being published in several languages is one attempt to address that, but a rather thin one, I think. I've been involved in reviewing grant proposals from the British Academy, which are designed to bring together writing teams from the global north and the global south. I've forgotten that they're called something like writing workshops or something like that, if you want to track that down. But those are ways in which it's not just people in the global north and publishers of top journals who teach people in the global south. It's a mutual kind of learning process. And I've been happy to read and review those kinds of proposals, some of which I think can make quite a significant change, particularly talking with early career scholars from Global South who need to learn the rules of the game, but hopefully also get to challenge the rules of the game a bit as well. So for good or bad, English is now the international language of scientific publishing. And I think there's probably not a lot that can be done about that, given how entrenched that is. So there are some technical things like keywords and abstracts that help a bit. There are things where the editorial boards can be made more diverse than they currently are in order to be aware of situation of the differences among those submitting to journals. But I don't know, it's not intractable, but it's part of a much wider process that's come to be called decolonising knowledge. And universities like the one we're in here at the University of Sheffield are taking that decolonisation process seriously. And it affects things like what's on a reading list for undergraduate students. It affects how we teach the history of a subject like geography, for example, which is deeply embedded in the politics of empire. It affects appointment panels and promotions processes and all the rest. So I don't underestimate the challenges of that, but I think it's at least being recognised now, and there are some sort of early faltering steps being taken.
And I think, building equitable partnerships across the world is another really important way of challenging that preeminence of the global north. That's what the Global Challenges Research Fund did do in some cases. I'm going to get political, but it's a shame that we've lost that. And the pandemic has made that more difficult. The opportunity to be in a place and to understand a place and to build partnerships in that place cannot be replicated by Zoom. I do a lot of work in South America that has been forged through joint workshops, meeting people, those collaborations turning into friendships, and those friendships being the basis of equitable research, collaborative research programs. I talk about friendships quite a lot because I think, when you're doing some of the work that we're doing that is interdisciplinary, you're out of your comfort zone, you have to really trust the people that you're working with. So invariably, you build a really kind of, I guess, dimensional relationship, personal and professional. And I think building those kinds of relationships with colleagues in the global south is absolutely critical.
Yeah, I think that's right. Respect and trust and non-extractive relationships are ethically sound and what we're committed to. Duncan said it's not the same on Zoom, but digital technologies can sometimes help with these kinds of issues. So tomorrow morning, Pamela Richardson Ngwenya is going to be talking about the way she uses participatory video in order to empower community groups, in this case in Zimbabwe, to apply for funding for sustainable community food projects. So in that case, she's using relatively novel technologies and trying to persuade people like the UNDP that rather than assuming that everyone can write a written proposal, everyone has a bank account, everyone has internet access, to use smartphones and limited internet resources to create a vehicle to bid for relatively small amounts of money that make really big changes to community groups in Zimbabwe. So that is a really, I think, good example of decolonisation in practice, where quite small resources from UK institutions, in this case it's the ESRC's Impact Acceleration Awards, can make quite significant differences. We also have the Sheffield Institute for International Development, which has been, I think, has been innovative, been a leader in thinking about the ethical engagements with things like the GCRF fund. So people here who are bidding for those funds are given some guidance and some protocols to follow to try to even up what is a very uneven power geometry between the various players involved.
Absolutely. So an interesting question here. The person says they heard entomophagy, eating bugs, is really sustainable. Are you at the Institute looking into bugs as a potential protein source for the UK populace?
Okay, I can answer that one. I had a PhD student who's now finished his PhD and is working at Wageningen University and Research in the Netherlands, whose research was absolutely about insect eating and its potential to have a transformative effect on food systems. The reason he's in the Netherlands is because his fieldwork was based there, because it was one of the countries where insect-based foods had made it into supermarkets, albeit in a quite limited way. And one of the things he was interested in is, can we get... often people say the resistance to insect eating as a human diet is the so-called yuck factor. It's all about individual psychology and overcoming, what is the nature of food and will bugs ever be part of people's diets. Jonas House's work on the topic showed that the resistance to insects as a staple part of people's diets in Western countries is very similar to their resistance to other novel foods. So is it cheap? Is it tasty? Is it in the supermarket and accessible to us? Those things are as bigger obstacles as the so-called yuck factor. So insects, in this case, in Jumbo stores in the Netherlands, were in burgers and minced products. They were designed to sort of mimic the meat and two veg staple diet of Dutch consumers. But they didn't work because they were slightly more expensive than veggie burgers or meat burgers. They didn't taste very nice. So consumers would try them once or twice and then not again. So even the most ecologically, environmentally committed consumers were reluctant to engage for insect foods. So insect foods, as you probably know, are widely consumed in other parts of the world. Chapulines, for example, are very popular food in Mexico. They can be quite high status foods as well. But I think there's this presumption that somehow they're not acceptable to consumers for what Jonas at least found was sort of the wrong reasons. It was not about individual psychology and distaste and yuck. It was much more about these more institutional or infrastructural things. And those I think can be addressed. But it suggests that the focus of research is somewhat misdirected, I'd say, in relation to insect-based foods.
So I think we've probably got time for one more.
Okay, let's go for one more. Yep.
So the last question then is, what impact do you think climate change will have on food production? And maybe I could start. I think it is already having an impact on food production. And I think one of the most potent ways that we're seeing climate change influence food production is through extreme weather. We're really now starting to see, even in the UK, our rainfall events become much more focused in time. So, we can often say in a year we're getting similar amounts of rain, but that will be in much smaller, fewer number of events than we would kind of traditionally expect. So we get these massive downpours interspersed with prolonged periods of drought. That's a direct consequence of climate change, and it reduces the amount of food that we can produce, makes it more expensive. And I think the features that we're going to see is food production is going to become more expensive in the face of climate change, as we have to put in infrastructure that allows us to mitigate against particularly the extreme weather events. we're going to see a reduction in the land area that we can grow food. We're already seeing now areas around the world from the limited sea level rise that's happened. We're getting inundation, we're getting salinisation of aquifers, which is really restricting the amount of fresh water that's available. And I think we're going to see an increase in technologies. So we recently published, my colleague, well, a number of colleagues, but led by Jill Edmondson and I published a paper in the journal Nature Food about the scope for cities to be self-sustainable for fresh fruit and vegetable production. And actually, if you embrace technologies like hydroponics that we're going to hear, and some of the work particularly that we're going to hear about from Gareth at Regather about local food production and values-based food systems, if we embrace those technologies and new ways of producing food, our cities can become quite sustainable, quite self-sustaining for fresh produce, for horticultural crops. So I think we're going to see a shift away from those crops grown in soil, in traditional soil-based agriculture. We're going to see that move into the cities where people are increasingly living. So yeah, I think we're going to see real major shifts in both the infrastructure, but the geographies that support food production.
And then also, I think climate change will force significant changes in food consumption. So consumption patterns are likely to change. There will, I think, almost certainly be a shift towards more plant-based diets. So the Eat Lancet report that came out a couple of years ago talked about the kind of dietary patterns at a global scale that will be needed in order to feed the world in an equitable way into the future. And that will fall to many of us who have Western meat and dairy-based diets to change. That might change because of a change in consciousness around climate, but it's almost certainly to be more likely to be driven by changes to the cost and availability of foods. So I think those changes towards vegetarian and vegan diets are likely to increase, possibly a reduction in meat consumption and a drive towards higher quality but less meat. Movements like Meatless Mondays and so on will become more prevalent. There may be in universities, for example, student unions that only serve vegetarian meals or a much more limited amount of meat and dairy based, far more alternatives on menus and so on. Food labelling that might focus on sustainability as well as on nutrition. So I think lots of those changes are going to happen. But one of the likely consequences is to increase inequalities between those who can afford, higher quality meat or dairy products or whatever, and those who can't. So I think climate change is going to force some real questions, not just in terms of food sustainability in an environmental sense, but also some of those questions about a more just food system. That's been one of the themes that we've talked about throughout today. So social justice and the kind of political movements that will come around food will be driven as much by climate change as by any other changes going on.
I think that's all we've got time for.
I think it is. So apologies for the fire alarms going off. That took us by surprise, and we apologise for that. Thank you very much for coming to this opening session of Planet to Plate. Do come back in a couple of hours to hear Ryan Tallier's aquaculture, and please look at the programme of events to see what else you might be interested in. There's a lot of things going on this week. We think they'll all be engaging in different kinds of ways. So yeah, thank you very much for coming. We hope this hasn't been too self-indulgent, the two of us chatting to each other, but we wanted to start as directors of the Institute for Sustainable Food to sort of set out what we're about, what our vision is, and what we think we've learnt from working together. So I don't know, last word from Duncan, but thank you all for coming, and thank you particularly for your questions as well.
Yeah, just to echo that, I'm sorry we didn't get to everyone's questions. I'll try and answer some of these on Twitter later on today. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. We've really enjoyed it, and hopefully we've maybe been a bit self-indulgent, but had the opportunity to really show how excited and enthused we are about the Institute for Sustainable Food, the diversity of the work that we're doing, and the real-world impact that the Institute for Sustainable Food is beginning to have. And hopefully you'll get a flavour of that throughout the course of this week's festival. So thank you very much.